My name is Linda, and I never imagined the past I tried so hard to outgrow would barge back into my life the way it did. I was sorting through work emails in my Portland apartment when the buzzer suddenly went off, and within minutes, my parents were standing in my living room, faces tight, voices rehearsed, acting like they were delivering a court order. They didn't come to see how I was doing. They came to inform me. "Your sister's wedding is falling behind schedule," my mother announced sharply, "and we need you to cover the remaining cost." My father placed a glossy wedding planning binder on my coffee table, sliding it toward me like a contract I had no choice but to sign. When I opened it, the number hit me like a punch: $85,000. Not a loan, not a request, a demand. The same parents who refused to support a single dollar of my college education were now expecting me to bankroll a luxury Lake Tahoe wedding simply because I had built a stable life for myself. They spoke as if my success obligated me to fix every mistake they made, like I was the family's emergency fund rather than their daughter. Something inside me locked into perfect clarity: their timing, their entitlement, their expectation that I'd fall in line again. It all snapped into place. I didn't know it then, but the answer I gave that night would crack open every illusion we'd ever held as a family, and none of us were ready for what it revealed. What happened next blindsided all of us, and one decision ended up unraveling the entire family. If you want to know how everything spiraled from that moment on, make sure you like this video and subscribe, because the truth only gets heavier from here. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, in a house where the rules were simple. Some children were praised, and some were expected to endure quietly. From the time I was old enough to understand anything, my older sister Rebecca Marlowe was treated like the centerpiece of our family. If she brought home a sketch she made in art class, my mother, Diane Marlowe, would tape it on the refrigerator and take pictures from every angle. If she learned a new dance routine, my father, Gerald Marlowe, would invite neighbors to watch her perform in the living room. There were small celebrations for every minor milestone. She reached ice cream after a school project, a weekend trip whenever she won a ribbon, a new outfit because she deserved something nice. Meanwhile, when I walked in with a report card full of A's, my mother would glance at it without lifting her head fully and say, "Good job, honey," before turning back to whatever she was stirring on the stove. My father would nod once, then switch the TV channel as if my achievements were background noise. The house itself seemed to orbit around Rebecca. Dance costumes hung over chairs, her art supplies took over the dining table, and my parents arranged their weekends around her rehearsal showcases and themed school events. I learned early that if I needed help with homework or wanted someone to drive me to a club meeting, I had to figure it out alone. When my senior year of high school came around and college applications became real, I finally gathered the courage to ask my parents for help paying the enrollment fee for the university I'd been accepted into. I still remember how tense that moment felt. Diane folded a stack of towels and said, "Linda, you're the younger one. You have to learn to be independent." Gerald added, "We can't use our savings for something you might not finish. College isn't guaranteed." Their words hit with a finality that left no space for negotiation. That afternoon, I started searching for part-time jobs, eventually juggling 2, then 3, while managing classes and the exhaustion that came with living on 4 or 5 hours of sleep. The only people who ever stepped in were my Aunt Patricia Harding and my uncle, Raymond Harding. They drove me to late shifts when my car broke down, slipped me money for textbooks without announcing it to anyone, and told me that wanting an education didn't make me selfish. Their support didn't erase the weight I carried, but it kept me from collapsing under it. Meanwhile, Rebecca received what felt like an endless line of advantages. When she turned 16, Diane and Gerald bought her a used sedan so she could get to practice safely. When she expressed interest in event planning, they rented a small studio room for her to host workshops. They paid for out-of-state summer programs, photography courses, and every piece of equipment she wanted. I watched it all unfold with a strange combination of numbness and clarity, slowly understanding that no matter how hard I worked or how quietly I tried to earn approval, I would never be the child they chose first. By the time I finished college, that truth had settled so deeply inside me that it shaped the way I moved through every part of my life afterward. Moving to Portland after graduation felt like stepping into a life I had to build from nothing, but it was the first time I'd ever had real control over my days. I accepted a position as a cybersecurity coordinator at a mid-sized tech firm, and while the pay wasn't glamorous, it covered the essentials and allowed me to rent a small apartment downtown. The place was compact with thin walls and a kitchen barely big enough for one person, yet it was mine, and that mattered more than anything. My work schedule quickly filled up. Mornings started before sunrise, evenings stretched into long hours in front of glowing monitors, and weekends often disappeared into reports and system audits. Whenever my family asked about my life, they would say things like, "Linda's always been good at taking care of herself," as if my independence were proof they didn't need to check in. Over time, I realized they used the word self-sufficient as permission to distance themselves. During the same period, my sister Rebecca Marlowe reinvented herself online. She built a polished image as a lifestyle and event planner, posting curated photos of color-coordinated parties, sponsored brunches, and holiday shoots. Her social circle grew, and with it came a confidence that bordered on entitlement. It wasn't long before she started dating Nathan Cole, whose family lived comfortably in Northern California and had a reputation for hosting high-profile events. The first time I met him was during Thanksgiving at our parents' house in Eugene, and the tension started before dinner even began. Rebecca walked into my apartment earlier that week, glanced around for barely 2 seconds, and said, "Wow, this is cozy," in a tone that made it impossible to hear anything but criticism. When I brought a homemade casserole to contribute to dinner, she poked at it and murmured, "Not really the standard Nathan's family is used to." Then she compared me to a friend's daughter who already had a six-figure salary and her own house at 26, delivering the remark like a helpful suggestion rather than a thinly veiled insult. For most of my life, I would have swallowed comments like that and let the moment pass. But something shifted inside me. I asked her to stop talking to me that way, and the air in the room snapped tight. Rebecca shot back with a condescending laugh, insisting she was just being honest, and before I could stop myself, I called her out for belittling me in front of family. The argument burst open sharp and fast, drawing the attention of our relatives as voices rose and accusations flew. My parents defended her immediately, saying she didn't mean anything by it, while ignoring the fact that every word she said was designed to wound. By the time dessert was served, the two of us weren't speaking. The next morning, I received a short text from Rebecca that read, "I don't want to be involved with you anymore," followed by a block of silence that stretched into months. It was the cleanest cut she had ever made, and in a strange way it told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in her life. The pressure from my parents didn't ease after their visit. If anything, it intensified in ways that felt deliberate, as if they thought repetition would wear me down. Diane Marlowe called the next morning with the same demanding tone she used when reminding us about childhood chores, telling me that the Cole family expected a Lake Tahoe wedding and that anything less would make us look small. Before I could respond, Gerald Marlowe jumped in from the background, insisting that this was the moment I should give back, because I had a stable job and no heavy responsibilities, as if my entire adult life could be summarized into a simple list of advantages. When I asked why Rebecca couldn't cover the cost herself, considering her successful business sponsorships and curated lifestyle, both of them dodged the question. Diane claimed Rebecca was emotionally overwhelmed, while Gerald muttered something about unpredictable event planning income, which didn't explain anything at all. By noon that same day, distant relatives began calling with unsolicited advice. One aunt scolded me for forgetting family duty, while a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 5 years told me I was being cold-hearted for refusing to help. Each call felt rehearsed, like my parents had circulated a script about me being ungrateful. Then my phone lit up with a familiar name, my Aunt Patricia Harding. Her voice was calm but urgent as she warned me that Diane and Gerald had been bragging to the family about my financial success for months, using my achievements as leverage to promise things they couldn't afford. According to Patricia, they had already implied to some relatives that I would support the wedding because Linda always steps up, painting me as a bottomless well of resources. Hearing that made something tighten in my chest, not just anger but disbelief that they would use my name so casually to build an illusion of wealth. I thanked Patricia for being honest, even though the truth stung, and as soon as we hung up, another notification appeared, this time, a text from Nathan Cole. His message was short and carefully phrased, saying that Rebecca was under pressure, that things were getting complicated, and that he hoped I would reconsider my decision for her sake. It was polite but manipulative in a subtle way, written like a plea, yet carrying an expectation beneath the words. I didn't reply. I blocked his number immediately, unwilling to open the door to a new round of persuasion. Standing in my apartment, the weight of everyone's expectations pressed against me, turning the walls into something smaller than they were. It became clear that refusing from a distance wouldn't be enough. The calls, the guilt, the twisted stories, they weren't going to stop unless I confronted the source directly. With that realization settling heavily in my mind, I grabbed my keys, aware of what I needed to do next. I had to drive to Eugene and face them in person, no matter how tense that conversation would become. Driving back to Eugene felt strange after avoiding that house for years, but the moment I stepped inside, the air tightened, as if the walls remembered every argument we had ever tried to bury. Diane Marlowe stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, looking at me like I had arrived to disrupt her peace, rather than to answer the demands she and my father had pushed onto me. Before I could even set down my bag, she accused me of being ungrateful, insisting that families were supposed to support one another, and that I had somehow failed them by refusing to hand over $85,000. Gerald Marlowe added that I was letting pride get in the way of doing the right thing, as though my entire adult life existed to solve the chaos they created. I took a deep breath and asked them the question that had been sitting inside me for years. When I needed help with school, where was this family? Then, neither of them answered. Diane looked away, while Gerald tapped the table like he was counting time until he could dismiss the topic. The silence broke when Rebecca Marlowe walked into the room, her expression sharp and amused, as if the whole situation existed for her entertainment. She greeted me with a mocking smile and said I was jealous that I had never understood what it meant to aim higher, and that her high-caliber wedding at Lake Tahoe was exactly what she deserved. She kept talking about image, prestige, and standards as though she were reciting a script written entirely for her ego. Something in me snapped into clarity the same way it had when they showed up in my apartment. I told them everything I had swallowed for years, how it felt to watch Rebecca be celebrated for the smallest achievements while I worked myself to exhaustion, how I was pushed aside when I asked for college support, how I carried the weight of being independent because they refused to be parents when it mattered. Each word came out steady, and for a moment I hoped they might understand. But Diane shook her head, accusing me of rewriting history, while Gerald claimed I was too sensitive and should stop holding on to old grievances. Their refusal to hear me burned more than any insult. When Rebecca rolled her eyes and said I was ruining the mood, I stood up and told her plainly that if she needed $85,000, she could figure it out herself because I wasn't her safety net. The room went still, and Diane's expression hardened in a way I had only seen once before. She pointed toward the door and told me that from this moment on their home had no place for me. Her voice didn't shake. It landed like a sentence she had been waiting to deliver. I didn't argue. I picked up my bag, turned away from all three of them, and walked out without looking back, feeling the weight of years lift and settle at the same time. Back in Portland, I threw myself into work using long hours and endless tasks to drown out the chaos I had left behind in Eugene, but the silence didn't last. A week later, my Aunt Patricia Harding called, with a tone that told me she wasn't delivering good news. She explained that the Cole family had recently reviewed the financial documents the Marlows submitted to secure the Lake Tahoe venue, and discovered that my parents had exaggerated their ability to pay the remaining $85,000, using my supposed willingness to cover the cost as proof of solvency. The venue managers, realizing they had been misled, immediately canceled the reservation and began legal proceedings against Diane and Gerald for misrepresentation, which sent shockwaves through both families. Patricia said Diane was blaming Rebecca for not keeping her finances in order, while Gerald insisted they were victims of unreasonable expectations, refusing to admit they had overextended themselves to impress people who barely knew them. The fallout moved quickly, and the next time my phone buzzed, it was a message from someone in the event planning industry I knew in passing. Word had spread that Rebecca Marlowe's wedding had collapsed under the weight of false promises, and clients began withdrawing from her upcoming projects, citing concerns about professionalism and stability. Sponsors backed out, partnerships dissolved, and the polished image she had worked so hard to maintain began to unravel in real time. Then another blow landed. Nathan Cole postponed the wedding, indefinitely telling his friends he needed to reassess financial priorities before making any long-term commitments. Patricia told me that Diane cried for hours, saying Nathan was abandoning Rebecca because she looked irresponsible, while Gerald kept repeating that I should have helped, that my refusal had triggered everything. That narrative spread fast, and by the following evening, I received a long text from Rebecca herself. She wrote that her career was collapsing, that Nathan was stepping back, that the Lake Tahoe venue was suing, and that our parents were devastated. She ended the message by saying, "Everything is falling apart because of you," as if my boundaries were the cause of their lies, their decisions, and their attempts to use me as a financial shield. I stared at her words until the screen dimmed, feeling no anger, only a strange clarity about how far they were willing to twist the truth to avoid responsibility. I didn't reply. I didn't owe her, Nathan, or my parents an explanation for refusing to be their safety net. For the first time, I understood exactly how deep the pattern ran, how they had always expected me to carry the consequences of choices I never made. Their financial trouble deepened, Rebecca's image shattered, and yet they still clung to the story that I was the root of their misfortune. Seeing that made one thing unmistakably clear. That was when I realized that without boundaries, they would drag me down with them. In the days that followed, I realized I could no longer leave any door half open for Diane, Gerald, or Rebecca to push through, so I sat at my dining table and drafted a short, precise email that would close every path back to me. I wrote that I was formally ending all communication, that any further attempts to contact me at home, at work, or through acquaintances would be considered harassment, and that I expected them to respect my decision without negotiation. I specified that none of them were to appear at my apartment, my office building, or any professional event connected to my field, and I reminded them that my boundaries were not optional suggestions, but conditions they would follow if they wanted to avoid legal consequences. After sending it, I blocked every phone number tied to the Marlowe household, then scrubbed my social media, sealing off messages from any account they might use to reach me indirectly. I contacted a local attorney, explained the recurring pattern of pressure and entitlement, and asked for guidance on filing a no-contact notice should my family escalate their behavior. He prepared the documents and advised me to keep them ready, saying I had every right to protect my space. With that in place, I signed a lease on a new apartment closer to my company, a quieter building with better security, and packed my belongings with the sense that each box removed a piece of the weight I had carried for years. When moving day came, the only people I told were Patricia and her husband Raymond, and we met at a small cafe afterward. I thanked them for every ride they had given me in high school, Every late night check in during college, every moment they had shown up when my parents didn't, and Patricia grasped my hand, saying she always knew I would build a life that wasn't defined by the Marlowe family's demands. Starting fresh in my new place felt like stepping into a version of adulthood that belonged entirely to me, no hidden obligations, no unspoken expectations, no guilt hanging from every decision I made. I settled into a routine that felt steadier than anything I had experienced before, waking early, focusing on my projects, and slowly reclaiming the emotional space I had allowed my parents and sister to drain for so long. On a quiet Thursday evening after unpacking the last box, I sat at my desk and signed the no contact notice my attorney had prepared, not because I planned to use it immediately, but because having it completed symbolized the final break I needed. The document carried the weight of everything I had survived, every ignored achievement, every unreasonable demand, every moment I had been treated as a resource instead of a daughter, and placing my signature at the bottom felt like reclaiming years of dignity they had tried to take. The folder snapped shut with a sense of finality I hadn't expected, and for the first time in a long while, I breathed without feeling the shadow of their expectations pressing at my back. When the dust finally settled, something inside me went quiet in a way I had never felt before. It wasn't relief that everything was over. It was the first hint of peace I'd had in years. I woke up the next morning in my new apartment and realized I didn't have to look at my phone wondering what demand would show up next, who would blame me for something I didn't do, or which family member would act like my existence was an inconvenience. The silence felt strange at first, but slowly it started to feel like freedom. For the first time, I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment. I walked to work that week feeling lighter than I had in a long time. My days weren't perfect, my schedule was still packed, and cybersecurity never slowed down, but the weight on my chest had changed. I wasn't carrying anyone else's expectations anymore. I wasn't being measured against a sister I could never please. I could finally hear my own thoughts without the constant buzzing of guilt my parents had trained into me. I began noticing little things I had ignored for years: the barista who remembered my order, the coworker who always held the elevator, the neighbor across the hall, who had a dog that barked every time it saw me, because it wanted attention, not because it wanted something from me. Letting myself enjoy those small moments felt like learning a new language. I let myself slow down. I started talking to my neighbors, even joining them for a weekend coffee run. I said yes to a game night invitation after months of politely declining. Healing didn't look dramatic. It was just me choosing to exist without apologizing for it. Some nights I thought about everything that happened, not with regret, but with clarity. For so long I had believed that if I worked harder, stayed quieter, or made myself smaller, my family would finally treat me like I mattered. But it didn't matter how good my grades were, how stable my career became, or how responsible I was. Their version of family wasn't love. It was obligation that only flowed one way. Realizing that wasn't painful, it was freeing. I learned that walking away wasn't betrayal. Sometimes it's survival. And sometimes the people who share your last name are the ones who break you the fastest, not because you're weak, but because they expect you not to fight back. Once you stop letting them decide who you are, everything begins to shift. Life isn't suddenly perfect, but it becomes yours. Standing at my new front door one evening, keys in hand, I understood something I had spent years running from, but never saying out loud. You don't need to stay connected to the people who hurt you just because they call themselves family. I took a deep breath, stepped inside, and let the truth settle fully for the first time in my life. Family isn't measured by blood, but by the boundaries you're brave enough to set